Welcome to this webinar of the Jerusalem Press Club, JPC, another press briefing in the series Israel is Alive and Kicking with Professor Avi Weiss, President of the Taub Center for Social Policy Studies in Israel, who will speak about Israel's economy in the shadow of COVID-19 following the release of the annual report of the center. Professor Weiss holds a doctoral degree from the University of Chicago. He has presided as a member of the senior faculty of Bar-Ilan University since '88. His area of expertise is applied economics, and his research focuses on industrial organization, antitrust, labor economics, law and economics, and more. Professor Weiss is the editor of the Economic Quarterly and associate editor of Economic Inquiry. In the public domain, Professor Weiss served as the chief economist and deputy director of the Israeli Antitrust Authority between 2003 and 2005 and was a member of numerous committees. Professor Taub will start with a short introduction, and then we'll open up for Q&A. Please type your question on chat. He'll answer them as much as he can. Needless to say, you'll have access to both to Professor Taub and to the report, either through us or directly with him, or with the center spokesperson, Anat Sela Koren, and this is a good opportunity to thank her for facilitating this, and also thank our own Raya Koval and Rachel Exil. Professor Weiss, please.
Thank you very much, Uri. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. This is going to be, I guess, a shorter talk than what I usually give you. Like earlier, when we gave one, I think it was at the beginning of the year this year. It's always a pleasure to get together with you people. This is a little bit less getting together than we usually do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a little bit of a share my screen with you, a little bit of a presentation. It's going to be a little bit different than what we usually do. Because usually what I do is I run with you through a lot of different graphs showing you what's going on, but I'm going to do it actually with a little bit more text this time because the situation really is so much different than it has been in the past. So the book I show you here at the top of the page just came out yesterday. It's available to everybody for free on our website. And of course, if you want a hard copy, you're going to have to wait a couple of weeks. It'll be back from the press in another week and a half. And then you're certainly welcome to ask us, and we'll be happy to send you hard copies. You can be in touch with Anat also with respect to getting in touch with us, speaking with us, setting up whatever you need in order to help you what you're doing along. With no further ado, I'm going to talk a little bit about Israel's economy. I call it in the shadow of COVID-19, which I think is appropriate. And we're going to concentrate, because we have so little time, we're going to concentrate really just on the macroeconomy and on the labor market. And then a little bit maybe winding it up at the end to talk about what to expect going forward. So Israel actually started very early. They started the shutdown of international travel really, really quickly with respect to people who weren't citizens of the country coming into the country. Quarantines and extreme social distancing really started relatively early. The result of that was, for a country that is as developed as we are and has a lot of international travel, we had relatively low rates of confirmed infections, and also very, very low rates of mortality. I'll show you what that looks like. So if you take a look at confirmed infections, and these are the countries in the OECD that we tend to basically compare ourselves to over and over again in so many different ways, you can see that with respect to the number of confirmed cases per population, okay, per capita, you're seeing that Israel is way below the average of what's going on. It's still above. Australia has done incredibly well. So is New Zealand. We all know about New Zealand. And Finland also did better than Israel, but most of the other developed countries in the OECD are actually above Israel with respect to the number of confirmed cases per population. Now, when we move that over to instead to look at the number of deaths, then the picture looks actually much more extreme, because Israel really is at the very, very bottom of the rung. Again, Australia has done better. Australia did an incredible job, but Israel really has a very, very low number compared to the other developed countries. Of course, were I to compare Israel to a different type of country, if I were to compare them to what happened in Thailand, if I compare them to what happened even in Poland, you would see that Israel actually has more deaths than they have. But still, this is an interesting comparison to see what's going on in Israel compared to these other places. Okay, so we've done pretty well with respect to the mortality that could have happened, what could have happened in Israel had we not started early. Now, what has helped Israel? What's helped Israel is a number of different factors. First of all, Israel has a very, very young population relative to other countries because of the large number of children that we have, the large fertility rates. And we also have a young infection distribution. So I'm going to show you what those two mean. So let's say we compare Israel to Italy, and we know that Italy really was an outlier. We know that Italy was one of the countries we concentrated on most because they had so many illnesses and so many deaths very, very early on in this story. We see that the build of the population is completely different. Israel is built here like a typical pyramid type of distribution. And we take a look at Italy, it looks more like a pear. And you can see that in Israel, you have relatively few 80 plus, even from 70 plus, relative to what's happening in Italy, where the percentages are much more significant. The result of that is, even if that were the only difference between us and Italy, you would expect a lot more or a lot less mortality in Israel because of the fact that it's the elderly who tend to be the ones who get complicated by this disease, who tend who they're the ones who are more likely to not make it past the disease once they get the disease. If were to add in the issue of confirmed infections, I told you that Israel, the distribution is very, very different. Well, take a look here in Italy at these older populations. You can see that not only do they have a lot of more elderly people, but the elderly people are really the ones who came down with the disease. It's not just the ones who died. They're the ones who came down with the disease a lot more in Israel. In Israel, you don't have that same skewness. This is really, really, it's amazing just how many of them really are the elderly. And look at Israel. The big group is 20 to 29-year-olds, are the people who came down with the disease. Now, why would that be? Why would you have so many 20 to 29-year-olds? I'll show you that in a little while, exactly where that came from. But it's very, very different. And that's also a very, very big benefit because these people aren't in great danger of actually dying from the disease, but these people here are. Okay? So those are major differences between Israel and Italy and most other countries. We have a relatively healthy population. We know longevity in Israel is very high. That's a sign of the health level of Israelis. And we also know that we have relatively low incidence of confounding factors. What do I mean by confounding factors? We all hear a lot about, this one had that disease, that one had this disease, and therefore that's why they died. It wasn't just the corona that did it. It was also the combination of the disease together with other things that that person already had in his background. Well, it turns out that Israel has very, very low heart disease compared to other countries. And if heart disease and malignancies are two confounding factors, and those are the two largest causes of death internationally. So therefore, having less of heart disease and less malignancies means that you had a lot fewer people who ended up dying because of the combination with corona. But in addition, Israel has we have a history of knowing how to deal with emergency situations. Unfortunately, we have had a lot of wars here, and we've had a lot of skirmishes here. And when that happens and people are given instructions to do certain things, to go into their homes, to go into the safe rooms, whatever it is that's needed, they know to do it, and they do it. And if you took a look at how Israelis acted, at least early on, that's changed a lot lately, but certainly early on, then you would see that there really was compliance with what was being told to them. And therefore, when there was an early shutdown, it did help quite a bit. If you take a look at what's working against Israel with respect to corona, then first of all is the ultra-Orthodox populations. It's not just ultra-Orthodox, but it's mostly ultra-Orthodox. It's also the fact that the synagogue is a place where people meet up with a lot of other people on a daily basis, a couple of times, 2-3 times a day. They get together with other people, and they get together in close proximity of a lot of people, and they're all touching the same prayer books and everything else that can cause the infection to spread, of what we know about now. And the problem in the ultra-Orthodox in particular, more than the modern Orthodox, is that in the ultra-Orthodox, they didn't take it seriously until very, very late. So therefore, they didn't break off immediately, while the modern Orthodox basically closed down the synagogues early. The ultra-Orthodox did not. They did not tell their people to stop going to the yeshiva and stop and etc. And now when you think about what we showed before, that oh, by the way, I'll just show you what that looks like. So this is dividing up Israeli populations by towns, and what the dominant population is in the town. You can see that the number of infections in the Haredi areas and in the mixed Haredi areas, which is, this has three cities in it. It has Jerusalem, it has Tzfat, Safed, and it has Beit Shemesh in it. You can see that they're way above any other populations, but you can also see that the Arab populations are very, very low in general in Israel. Very, very low compared to even the non-Haredi Jewish populations, the confirmed rate of infection. Now that also, by the way, explains a lot of what we saw over here, because of the fact that these ultra-Orthodox populations are also very, very young. They have a lot of children. And therefore, there's a very large percentage of the people in those yeshivot, in those schools of Torah study, in the shuls, in the synagogues, tend to be relatively young people. And therefore, you have a lot of infection during for these populations that you did not have inside of Italy. Okay, so now let's turn to macro. So that was a little bit of background in order to show you what's going on. With respect to the macro situation, so in order to understand what's happened, you have to know where you came from and know where you're going, as the famous Pirkei Avot says. And coming into the economy, Israel had high GDP growth, but it's been falling for about a decade, and it was below average if you look at GDP per capita, because Israel has about 1.9% growth in population every single year. So therefore, if you calculate GDP per capita, it's below the average of the OECD countries, the developed countries. We have decreasing prices in Israel since about 2014 or so, because of a lot of opening of markets to international trade, but prices in Israel are still high. They're on average about 12% higher than in the OECD. That's lower than it used to be. It used to be more expensive, and that's improved over the past more than half a decade. Basically, since the social protests in 2011, but it took a few years for that to get started. Income inequality in Israel has been decreasing. I'll just show you this one because it's so unusual compared to other countries. So this is the Gini factor, the Gini index, which is a number between 0 and 1. The higher the number, the more unequal you are. And what you see here is that for about 15 years now, inequality in Israel has been falling, but it is still higher than most of the other countries. So it's been falling, but it's still high. And we're going to talk about what's going to happen for each of these. I'm sorry, I've got to go back. Okay, and it's been we have a decreasing deficit for a long period, and that's very, very important. And that's a big but I'm going to talk about that deficit. I'm going to show it to you in a short while. It has been increasing significantly in the last 2 years. So that's something that's important to understand, that the deficit in Israel had been going down for a long period until about 2017. In 2017, it was about 2%. And then a couple of decisions were made in 2018, 2019 that actually increased that deficit to close to 4%. The projection for 2020 was more than 4%. We're going to see that given everything that's happened, 4% would have been fantastic, but we're not going to be anywhere near that. And we have a very low debt to GDP ratio. It's about a little bit under 60%. 60% is what the OECD wants. We're one of the few OECD countries that's actually there, that actually has a low enough debt GDP ratio to be within the goal of the OECD. But now here is what we can expect with respect to each of these 5 issues. So with respect to GDP growth, there's an expectation, this is the Bank of Israel's expectation, although it's a little bit old by now, it needs to be updated. They were expecting the GDP to fall by over 5%, which means GDP per capita falling by over 7%. Now this is instead of increasing by 4%. So that's a very, very big drop. But then they're talking about a significant recovery in 2021 of almost 9%, 8.7% or 8.9% is what they're looking at. If you take a look at the IMF data, they're actually looking at an even bigger drop in Israel this year, more than just the 5%. We don't know yet what's going to happen, but we're going to find out. Prices, we don't know if they're going to go up or down, because what you have is you have a decrease in the supply because of all the people who stopped working for a while, and because of all the people who continue not working, and because of the businesses that have closed down and will close down. All that will decrease the supply. You have a decrease in demand because people have less income. They have less income, then they're not going to buy as much. And there's a huge increase in uncertainty. And uncertainty, when there's a situation of uncertainty, people tend to save just in case. And therefore, all kinds of purchases that perhaps people wanted to do, they won't do when they're under uncertainty. And therefore, that decreases the demand. We don't know which of those is stronger, so we don't know what's going to happen to the price level. Income inequality will almost certainly go up because of the fact that the populations that have been harmed, I'll show you that in a minute, are the weakest populations inside of Israel. It's not the stronger people. It's not the highly skilled people who are out of jobs. It's the people who are working at very, very low paying jobs. They're the ones who have lost their place of employment for now. The deficit will go up from 4%, I told you before, is what they were expecting, to about 11%. Now, it's okay to spend a lot of money now, but I'll just say one thing. Had we not increased that deficit over the past couple of years, then we would be in a much stronger situation than we are in right now. And what you have to understand is that, think about your own finances. Let's say you have income, good income, during the middle years of your life. And what do? You save money for your pension. You save money for later on. When you are earning a lot, when you are doing well, when the economy is strong, that's the time you should be lowering the deficit, not the time you should be increasing the deficit. It's not you say, we're doing really well, let's spend even more than that, because you need that money for the rainy day. And this is the rainy day. I know it's 40 degrees outside, but this is still the rainy day. You can see that I'm in the Caribbean somewhere, so that's fine. We're in a rainy day. And I think I just missed one. And the debt GDP ratio will go up from about 60% to about 75%, maybe even up to 80%. But this is when you need to do that. This is the rainy day, as we said. And the fact that you have such a good debt to GDP ratio means that the world is willing to lend you money. And with the world being willing to lend you money, you're able to overcome the difficulties of the time. And therefore, this is the time to spend that money. A little bit about labor markets. The labor markets before the pandemic were very, very strong. Obviously, we know the Haredi men, ultra-Orthodox men, and Arab Israeli women tend to work a lot less. Again, I'm running through this because we don't have a lot of time. We had a very long period of increasing salaries over time, but they were decreasing over time. The increase has been decreasing. You can see all these numbers are positive. This is growth. Since 2015, we've always had an increase in wages, but it's become slower as time went on. And this year, it's definitely going to slow. In other words, you can clearly expect income to go down this year, wages to go down this year. There are so many people unemployed that the salaries that will be paid will just end up being lower. There's no question the labor markets were greatly, greatly disrupted. There was 25%, 27%, 28% who were either laid off or put on leave, very, very high percentages. But that's partially to a very large extent because of the way that the government did it, that they told companies not to keep their workers, to put them on unpaid leave. And as a result of them being on unpaid leave, they included all of those as if they're unemployed. Now, usually somebody who's on unpaid leave is not considered unemployed because they're still considered connected with their employer. But in this case, they consider them unemployed. So those numbers include about 90% of the people who were put on unpaid leave who are expected to go back. 90% of the people who left who were on unpaid leave, most of which are going to go back to their old jobs, but not all. Some of them will not. And if you just take a look at what I said before, who it was that was laid off, it was people with about 60% of the average income. So it's not the strong people who were laid off here, it's weak people who were laid off here, and who will have trouble, many of them, if they don't go back to their old job, they may have trouble finding new jobs. We know that many businesses are likely to fail, certainly many smaller ones, certainly in certain industries. Think about the tourism industry, think about restaurants, that there will be places that will not be able to live through what's gone on here, and there will be turnover, there will be change, there will be new places opening up, but there will be places that will close down. And therefore, if you think about what's going to happen to unemployment, it's going to go down. It's going to go down a lot. But the good case scenario is where you go down to single digit. If you can get down below 10% this year in 2021, in 2020, I'm already next year. If you can get down below 10% in 2020, then you're doing well. Okay. The truth is, it should be probably the best guess is somewhere around 10 to 11%. So that's what we can probably expect from 2020. And as I said before, the weakest workers are the ones who are being harmed the most. They're going to be the last ones to be reemployed, and it's going to increase inequality and increase poverty, as we expect. Training programs. This is the time to help the weaker populations to improve their skills, give them more human capital skills. And that's something that's actually happening. The employment ministry actually offered from the beginning, not quite the beginning, but almost the beginning, they offered a lot of online courses to people who were unemployed. And a lot of people took them in all kinds of different subjects to be able to shore up your skills so that if you do lose your job, you can find a better job afterwards. Or even if you don't lose your job, you can try to move up to something even better. And if you think about a silver lining from all this, then one silver lining might be that we've learned how to do this conference now, this discussion online, to do it over Zoom. People are learning how to work remotely. Now, people learning to work remotely can help certain populations. So when I say women here, I'm thinking about women we're still in a society in which women bear most of the burden of raising children, of raising a family. And if you have a woman who is raising a young family and she wants to work in a high-tech firm or in a firm that's going to require a lot of work, she may not be able to do that. And that can affect her opportunities that she has. And it could even affect what she decides to learn. But if we have this possibility of working from home, at least partially, then that can help a lot in allowing them to be absorbed into better paying jobs. The same is true with Arab Israelis who live in the northern villages and are far away from the places of employment in high tech. So when they're in high school, they're learning a lot of computers and they love it, and they learn physics, mathematics. When they decide to go to college, they have to think about where they're going to get a job. And unless they're willing to move to Tel Aviv area, they're going to have a lot of difficulty finding good employment in those areas. So when they go to college, they go and study education. If they have this opportunity to work remotely, then that can change, and they can both, at an early point, start learning things that will be more remunerative to them. So summing up, because I'm probably past my time. Summing up, reopening the economy, we have to think a lot about helping employers. So one thing is obviously decreasing the amount of bureaucracy. That right now businesses have had a really hard time figuring out what they should do, when they should do it, how much they can get, what they can't get. A lot of uncertainty about what's going on. We have to think about incentives. There's a lot of discussion about incentives to reabsorb workers into the workforce, to take them back, and of course hire new people. And one of the things we might want to think about, I'll talk about in a second, but I'll leave that for now. And you also want to think about firms that did not lay people off but lost income. So therefore, they were very good to their workers. They continued employing them, but because they lost income, they're going to be punished. So you might want to help them out also, and not just the ones who are absorbing new workers. Reopening the economy with respect to helping employees. Here, one of the important things, aside from the training we talked about before, and investment in infrastructures are really important, by the way. I didn't talk about that. But one of the things that you may very much want to do is go towards the German model, where the German model basically said workers can work part-time in the firm, come in a couple days a week, and for the other time, they will get unemployment insurance prorated to the amount of time that they're not working. So therefore, you don't have to take people full-time. You don't say, as soon as you go in and work, you're no longer going to get any unemployment insurance. If you go part way, then you allow a lot more workers to get back into the labor force. And that's obviously very, very good for the economy. And finally, preparing for the next wave now. We don't know if there will be a next wave, but there's a large expectation that there will be one. And you know, when you come into a situation that's a surprise, what happened early on this year, you know, nobody really knew what to do. Nobody knew all the implications. Nobody knew exactly what was going to happen. And in that situation, when you try to do things, you're going to make mistakes. Okay, not always. You can be Australia and do it really, really well. But a lot of places made mistakes, made the wrong decisions, and that's true in Israel. Not everything worked out as perfectly as you would expect. But in that type of situation where you have to work under so much uncertainty, then maybe you can forgive a lot of mistakes. Maybe you can say, okay, they tried and not everything was perfect, but there were some successes in what happened and some failures. The thing is, when you come to a second stage, then you don't have that forgiveness anymore. Because now we know what's worked and what hasn't worked. Now we know what other countries have done and what's worked there and what has not worked there. Now we know what to expect. And I think the two words that are probably most important are transparency and predictability. Firms have to know what to do exactly if the government tells them to shut down because there are people who got sick. What are they entitled to? How do they apply for it? How do they get it quickly? How much do they get? You know, when do they get? When do they not? Workers have to know exactly what's going to happen if they're laid off. You need to know what's happening in order to be able to move this forward, and that's got to be determined now. Of course, you're going to have massive testing. There's lots of medical issues. We haven't discussed medical issues at all, but with that, I'm gonna stop.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Weiss. I'm always impressed by the way you can squeeze so much information in such a wonderful way in such a short time. Thank you indeed. Two questions. How do you expect Israel to be affected by weaker or depressed economies abroad, by changes in supply chains? And what do you expect to happen in the real estate market?
Well, certainly you're going to expect that Israel will be affected by the demand for their products outside of the country. Now, one of the things that we do is we do export quite a bit, and therefore, as demands fall coming from outside the country, that's going to hurt you. That's going to hurt you the same way it hurt you in 2008, when there was a world recession, and it didn't really hit Israel very hard. But the reason it did hit Israel is because of demands from other countries. So that can be expected to happen here. How large it's going to be, we just don't know yet. With respect to the second part of the question, real estate market. That's a really interesting question. The expectation is that the real estate market will not be as strongly affected as other markets. You might see real estate prices going down. That's what I think might happen, but a lot of people don't think so. So I'm just not sure what's going to happen there, but it will almost certainly be. First of all, it's protected from international trade. Okay, so there, what's happening in international markets won't hurt you at all. But all told, and unless we continue to go into more waves and they're as significant as the first one was, it's probably not going to be a huge effect. They continued building even during the most secluded parts of it.
A question from one of our journalists: what would you advise? What would be your advice to the new Ministry of Finance, or Minister of Finance? What should be the priorities? And may I add to this a note that I spoke with one of the ministries of finance, not the last one, not Kahlon, and he was critical of the way the government threw money indiscriminately. He thought that such a crisis was an opportunity to reshuffle, to change or to invest or kick in money into areas that should be developed.
I'm going to actually take the almost the opposite view of that and tell you that they didn't throw money enough. You know, and this would not necessarily usually be my take on things, because as you said when you introduced me, I'm a Chicago economist, and therefore my natural tendency would be to say intervene in the market as little as possible. But if there's a situation where you really need government intervention, this is it. This is a place where the free market isn't going to solve it alone, and you need massive intervention in order to make sure that the entire economy doesn't collapse. Now, you needed to do it early. You needed to do it fast. It wasn't necessarily done fast enough. It wasn't necessarily done early enough. But it's a situation in which you need to throw things at it, and even if you make mistakes, you made mistakes. Even if you threw too much, so you could have done it more carefully, but then it would have been much slower. And then there would have been a lot that you would have missed. So maybe you threw too much, but you could have done better. Now, let me get back to the first question. With respect to what I would suggest to the new finance minister, one of the things that obviously trying to help the businesses that have suffered a lot is very, very important. Not all of them will survive, and not all of them have to survive. Some of them were very inefficient, and some of them going out of business is actually may not be a bad thing at all. That may not be a nice thing to say, but it's true. Businesses fail all the time. And therefore, you don't necessarily have to save every single business, do everything you can so that nobody will go out of business. That would be a big mistake. But one of the things that I think really needs to be done, or needs to be to change from last time, is I would not send workers out on unpaid leave unless there was no choice. I would much rather the German model in which you keep them in the firm, keep them connected to their firm, and then when things open up again, it's much harder for the firm to then fire them. It's not a situation where now they have to bring them, it's like an opt-in versus an opt-out. You have to bring the guy back into the firm. Well, it's easy to say, listen, I can't bring you back, sorry. It's much harder when the person is still working in the firm, and then to say, I have to let them go. Now, what we're facing now is a very large level of unemployment. That's a disruptive force. Now, one thing I'll also mention, and this is not in direct answer to the question, but a lot of people are going to be looking at unemployment numbers. Unemployment numbers aren't the wherewithal of the issue. Because what happens when you have this type of recession is that a lot of people look for a job for a long time, and at some point they stop because they give up. Now, unemployment is defined as people who are not employed but are looking for a job. If people decide to drop out of the labor force, they stop looking for a job, it's going to look like the unemployment numbers went down. So, but really, it's not that the employment numbers have gone up. It would be more important, in my opinion, to look at employment numbers than to look at unemployment numbers.
Last question. You mentioned before that the estimate for GDP in 2021 is an increase of 9%. Isn't that too optimistic? It's based on what?
It's based on the economy recovering. Don't forget, you're going to be moving down to a much lower base, and therefore to increase from there, it's basically going back to the original trajectory. So if you go back to the original trajectory, you're going to make up those 5% that you lost, and the additional 4% almost that you would have grown this year without that. So you're still going to lose the loss from this year, but it's only going to be a one-year loss. Now, this is very, very much dependent on there not being a third wave next year. You know, this is very dependent on getting back to a situation where you're not at 10% unemployment, where you go back closer to 6, 7% unemployment, whatever it is, lower than obviously higher than it was until now, but nothing near where it wasn't, you know, now where it is right now.
Let's go to the real last question, okay? Are you surprised that the ratings agency keeps the good ratings of Israel?
No, not really, because you know, there was a danger when the deficits went up to 4% that they were talking even then about not necessarily keeping it good. But the situation that's happened now is an international situation. This isn't something that happened in Israel. This is something that happened everywhere, in all countries. And the fact that Israel is able to enter this with such a good debt to GDP ratio means that it is really believed internationally that Israel can service the debt. When they can service the debt, that means that you're going to be able to borrow at very good interest rates. Now, that doesn't mean it won't change further on, but if Israel manages to ride this wave successfully and is able to recover in 2021, like we spoke about before, then I don't think it's necessarily going to lower the credit rating. I think that companies are going to be a little bit careful because everybody's going to suffer now. It's a worldwide suffering, not just Israel.
Professor Weiss, it's always great to have you with us. Thank you very much. Guys, you have Anat Sela Koren's details on the chat, so you can contact her for all the information you need. Thank you, and stay tuned to our next webinars. We're going to announce them shortly.
It's always a pleasure, Uri. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.